the general mood is that companies are very much focusing on the short-term operational issues, making sure that there's cash flow is okay, and they can manage through this very difficult down cycle. For the Chinese government standpoint, of course, the lockdown and the fight against the coronavirus over the last couple of months was a big deal, and now the government is focusing on returning things back to normal. So I say the sentiment are quite different depending on whether you're talking about the private sector versus the public sector.
Do you feel there is a difference when it comes to private sector and public sector and the mood and the optimism that you are mentioning?
It depends on what kind of companies within the private sector, because the performance varies by industries. As you know, for example, the auto industry has been really hit hard by this pandemic. In fact, the growth rate for the industry has slowed down since last year anyways, but the pandemic has really made it very serious. So if you're in the auto industry these days, it's very tough. But if you're in industry or sectors where demands have been surging during the pandemic, and with that I mean companies who are engaging in e-commerce, online businesses, remote communication like what we're doing now, remote education. Those companies are doing very well.
Look at China's trajectory. It's sort of inevitable, right? Cases are going to come back once economic resumes, and perhaps China cannot singularly even economically recover. There's no point to talk about a full economic recovery until the rest of the world recovers with it.
Yeah, I think on a global basis, the impact is going to be pretty prolonged, meaning for the rest of this year, maybe even into next year. But within China itself, actually China has done a pretty good job, as you know, of arresting the pandemic, and things are beginning to get back to normal. Well, of course, without the usual trades with the rest of the world, China also is not isolated. But within China itself, the Chinese government can do a lot, actually. As you know, the Chinese government has earmarked quite a lot of money into building infrastructure, in particular digital infrastructure, to try to drum up the economy. Personal consumption or personal demand has been sort of depressed for a long time, and now people are quite willing to go out and spend money. Watch out for the May 1st holidays, the Labor Day holidays. I think you will get a sense of the kind of consumption power of the Chinese people once they regain the confidence. So I think domestically, we're going to see a pretty steep rebound already, but globally, it's still going to be a problem for some time to come.
What does it mean for a consulting business like yours at Feng Advisory? Do you get more clients in such an environment, or do companies have to cut costs and cannot afford consulting services anymore because they're pretty expensive?
Of course, consulting budget is almost always the most discretionary budget for many companies. So indeed, the whole consulting industry has been hit quite a bit by the downturn as well because of the reduction on the budget from our clients. But for us at Feng, we have actually a substantial increase in inquiries from companies who are interested in what to do with the pandemic, in particular on two issues. One is, how should I think about my China strategy post-pandemic? And China strategy, as you know, Martina, is always a part of the global strategy for global companies. Secondly is how should I think about my supply chain? Because of the disruption that happened during the pandemic. And some people have been advocating that supply chains should be moved from China. So how should I, as a CEO of global companies, think about that? So we do get a lot of inquiries in two areas.
So I want to go back to the Chinese economy question. Can Chinese economy really just recover by itself? You sound quite optimistic to me. And for second quarter, I mean, first quarter, we all saw that it's all over, I should say, every sector. But it's not going to be any better for the rest of the world. But when it comes to China's second quarter, where are we going to stand?
Yeah, second quarter is going to be sort of a slow, so-called recovery, but not really. China cannot get out from the hole that it dug itself into in the first quarter because of the pandemic, right? China have lost over 6%, or 6.3% of GDP in the first quarter, and I don't expect a sharp rebound from the second quarter. But perhaps in the third quarter and fourth quarter, that we're going to see somewhat of a rebound from it. Is it going to compensate everything before the pandemic? Probably not, because the rest of the world is not ready. But would China continue to be at a minus 6.3% for the rest of the year? It's unlikely. I think ultimately we're going to see something like 0% or 1% net growth for this year, something like that. It's not going to be significant, but it's also not going to be significantly negative.
Taking all of this into account, Ed, I saw on your LinkedIn as well that you've shared an article by The Economist about whether foreign companies will exit China, given this pandemic and this economic environment and market turmoil. Do you think that this will happen, or is it just still a market that you can obviously not ignore?
Well, of course, the whole notion has been clouded by announcement by the Japanese government and also comments made by U.S. senior government officials, saying that in a way they would like to encourage the companies to get out from China, right? And around the same time, Renault, the French automaker, announced the plans to terminate its joint venture with Dongfeng, Wuhan. So all these things seem to come together, and people became very sensational. And people began to talk about, wow, there's going to be a mass exit from China. In reality, is at least my interactions with my clients, and as you know, Bettina, many of the clients are Fortune 500 global CEOs or senior executives. And first of all, the current focus is very much on the short-term operational issues to ensure that the cash flow is okay and so on, so that they can sustain the business. Second of all, to them, China has always been very important, and of course, how important China is going to be depending on how the world will look like post-pandemic. So one of the key questions that global CEOs are asking is that, how would the world look like post-pandemic? What is the new world order that will manifest itself, and how China will play to that? And so right now, actually, most CEOs don't have a clear answer themselves, himself or herself, or even the board. Normally do not have a universal answer yet. Therefore, they're not ready to pull any major decisions as to getting out of China. So based on my interactions directly with many of my clients, I don't see any signs of massive exodus from China. I think that's really too early to tell.
Yesterday, there was a Harvard professor who actually talked about this very subject, and I thought it was spot on, because currently, world, we're going into waves of this global pandemic. It is probably difficult if you're talking about a company who tries to, actually relocate the supply chain closer to home. Home is in turmoil. I mean, where is going think about any relocation over the next year or so reasonably. So I think it's going to be a long, painful process. But what comes with it is what comes with supply chain calibration is actually de-globalization. And I think that is a genuine scenario. We started to see more and more China-US decoupling. Yesterday, on Friday, actually, FCC, Federal Communications Commission in the United States, announced that they are probably looking at removing the licenses for Chinese telecom operators in the United States. And so with the decoupling, the de-globalization process, is that real? I mean, where is China going to be featured in this whole decoupled and divided world?
I don't see a clear-cut decoupling scenario going forward. Even before the pandemic started, actually there's been efforts that was made mostly by the U.S. government to try to limit or restrict the operations of Chinese companies, in particular in the tech sector in the U.S. And that's going on as a policy. And I expect that, as long as this current administration will continue to be in power, I expect that will somewhat continue. But that doesn't mean it's an entire decoupling.
Right. So basically, Ed, you think that China will be seen and continue to be seen by the U.S. companies as the consumer destination, the target market. But what about the
by definition, because China has over 300 million people who are classified as middle class.
What about that? Doesn't sound like a very cooperative way of thinking about globalization. China as the destination market. And perhaps back in the 1980s, I must say, China probably saw the US as the final destination market as well. We didn't know. But is there anything else left? I mean, that's not decoupled, or I'm trying to get a sense, between China and US, what are the necessary components that can perhaps never be decoupled?
Well, let's take auto industry, a big deal, huge, even though right now it's depressed, right? But for a long time, China was the largest auto market for the world, and still is actually. And it's been a money printing machine for GM and for Ford, and for the matter, as you know, for the German Big Three, for a long, long time. And why is that going to be a decouple? China is not kicking out Ford. Is China not kicking out GM? And the Germans are doing really well in China despite the current, depressed situation. And China is going through. The Chinese government is supporting the growth of new energy vehicles, connected and intelligent vehicles. China will get out from this depressed situation and become a very significant market again, if not the largest market. And so this innovation will provide input of room for growth for global companies like the ones that I mentioned, as well as for emerging Chinese players, the Chinese disruptors who are trying to disrupt the big incumbents. Right? So I don't see any major decoupling in a major industrial sector like the auto industry.
It is just a temporary situation, right? I mean, for example, if we look at air travel, the International Air Transport Association says that 60% of the people in the world that they surveyed, at least, they want to travel again. About 40% they want to wait a little bit longer, maybe until the end of the year. But we also need borders to reopen, commerce and traffic, to kick off again. So then hopefully things will normalize again. But it will definitely take a couple of months for sure.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. It won't be easy, but over time we're going to go back to normality. That's for sure.
I want to ask you about the recent government rescue programs that are launched by various countries during the pandemic. Say in the United States now, starting from the beginning of March, we're seeing an additional $3 trillion of fiscal debt. And with this sort of debt, somebody has to pay for it. And is China going to continue to buy U.S. Treasuries? Should China stop buying? I mean, what would be the strategy, you think?
Well, first of all, the U.S. is in a privileged position because the U.S. dollar is the de facto sovereign currency for the world, and so they can decide to print money, whatever way they like to print. In fact, I think they call this like limited QE now, right? It's pretty scary, but it looks like that is now the strategy. I think for the rest of the world, it has a lot of side impact. We don't know how inflation is going to be impacted because of so much money is going to be put into the system. I think for those of us who own the homes, we may be in a pretty good position because property value will probably go up. But for people who don't have a home and just rely on cash, it's going to be pretty tough, actually.
Difficult all around. But what do you think China should do?
Well, I think China, we need to think carefully about what is the strategy going to be. On one hand, with the current situation, I don't believe they really have a whole lot of choices aside from sort of buying the U.S. Treasury, use it as a way to keep the foreign reserve. But at the same time, the Chinese is also taking another step, which is a major step that could disrupt the financial global order in no time, which that, as you know, the Chinese government have announced a pilot testing case of using a digital currency in Hangzhou. Hangzhou is going to start, it will be the first city in China to start piloting the use of the sovereign digital currency. And as you know very well, once China, get the pilot program going on, once one city works well, they would expand it to a few more, and then a few more, and then before you know, become a nationwide thing. And once China develop an alternative to the US dollar, and also technologically more advanced than the current way of the US dollar is working, China actually have a very strong advantage in the hands.
This is exciting. So do you actually believe, Ed, that China's digital currency will take over the US dollar in the next couple of months or years?
No, not in a couple of months. I'm not even sure in a couple of years.
Speed, right?
What's the timeline you would give?
No. I also don't believe that it's going to replace the US dollars. But in specific occasions or specific circumstances, the Chinese digital currency may be used as a trading currency and will bypass the US dollar because it's digital, so it's going to be much more convenient, and it's going to be blockchain based, and therefore it's going to be much more securitized. So I think you're going to see more taking up of digital currency once it rolls out to outside of China to countries along the Belt and Road Initiative.
Yeah. So Ed, I guess we have 20 plus years or so to continue to discuss on this question now, but I just want to make a point adding to yours. The digital currency is indeed a huge launch, but actually I was surprised as well. The central bank announced when they were pilot testing, they said it's actually not going to be blockchain based at the moment. But I want to zoom back into China again for a second. You are a globally recognized expert in management. And so in China, starting from 2018-19-ish, there has been this move to, again, consolidate state-owned enterprises even into bigger, colossal global enterprises that are essentially not only too big to fail, but too hard to compete against. So that trend, regardless of the pandemic, has been happening structurally over the past, I would say, a few years. And how do you see this shift within China with even bigger state-owned enterprises and the President Xi and the Vice Premier Liu He talking about the state-owned enterprises are going to become bigger, better, and stronger? And what does that mean to the private enterprises?
There has been certain combination or consolidation of SOEs together into bigger SOEs. That's for sure. That happened, as you know, in the telecom industry, in the high-speed rail industry, in a few other industries as well, or before that in the oil and gas industry. So that happened. But to say that the entire state-owned industry has been consolidated into a few colossal-sized, major, huge enterprises, and the rest cannot survive is oversimplification. That's actually not the case, especially in sectors that are open or semi-open. When I said open and semi-open, we're talking about, for example, auto industry, consumer goods, retail, telecom equipment, that kind of stuff. And you see that typically in those sectors, it's not one or two major SOEs who control the whole thing. It is actually SOEs and private-owned companies as well as foreign companies trying to compete with one another. And oftentimes the competition is the world class. This is because China is big. Everybody wants to get a piece of the pie. Incredible competition. Because of incredible competition, it drives a lot of innovation, as you know. And so along the way, actually, in some cases, some SOEs have had the upper hand. But in many cases, actually, private companies have been winning out. They are at the winning end, and SOEs are not to be seen. Take e-commerce. We just talked about that quite a bit. Digital. Essentially, SOEs are not to be found at all. They're all private companies, even though some of the private companies are supported by venture funds of the SOEs, but that doesn't mean that they are SOEs. So I think to simplify the situation in China as SOEs are dominant, private companies are being squeezed out is an oversimplification. In reality, it's a much more pluralistic situation where SOEs, privately owned companies, foreign companies are all on one hand fighting against one another because of competition. On the other hand, in many cases, they're also collaborating with one another, especially during a pandemic like what we just went through. Without the close collaboration with the local government, SOEs, privately owned companies, including foreign companies, these specialist hospitals in Wuhan will not have been built within 10 days or 2 weeks. It's not possible. Only through close collaboration of all these kind of companies and the government things could happen. And that's the China model. And there's a power of the China way of making
obviously China has been very, has shown over and over again, particularly during this crisis, the uniqueness and I should say, the efficiency of the China model. There's no doubt. But how would you explain what President Xi said last year at the fourth plenum of the Party's Congress?
I understand.
Must play a dominant role in the Chinese economy. How do you interpret that?
Yeah, I understand, Shirley. By the way, as you know, 1 week later, he also said in Tianjin that the private sector is also very important.
Important, yes, but a dominant role is dominant role. How would you interpret a dominant role?
Yeah, there are certain industries in China where you require the SOEs to really play a leading role because, if you don't have the SOE to participate, it's very difficult to build those industries in the kind of time and speed.
Especially the banking industry and aviation, for example, right?
Aviation, yeah. Well, high-speed rail is a prime example. The reason why high-speed rail was not able to be built in America, the world's most advanced nation, the most powerful nation, America's not built. Well, I was in California for a long time, and when I was in California, they were talking about building a high-speed rail from San Francisco to Los Angeles. That is still not being built. But today, what happened in China. The reason why that could happen was because the SOEs were driving it. SOE were driving it because they don't make the same economic calculation as people in the private sector, right? We know that, right? We study economics, we do rate of return analysis, and the rate of return have to achieve a certain number before you do it. SOEs don't do that. So they look at the utility for the people and the society as a more general measure, right? So including a high-speed network, or for the matter, digital infrastructure all across China, for the matter, sending, somebody or to the orbit of the Earth. or building the world's largest satellite observation satellite in Guizhou. That's the job of the SOEs. You don't rely on the private sector to do that, right? So that is what President Xi was referring to. But he did not say that the private sector is not important at all, right? The power of the Chinese model or Chinese system is actually you have this dual system, a dual structure. You have the SOE who plays the role that SOE ought to play. You have the private companies who are very entrepreneurial, very agile, very speedy, and very innovative, and they do all things in a very short period of time. So the top combination is actually what many other Western countries do not have. And that's
and do you think this symbiosis, this dual system is working well?
In most cases, yes. Of course, it has its grudges. Because, of course, in some cases, people would say, well, especially when you're trying to compete with one another, you say the SOE would have some advantages or privileges. They can get loans easier from the banks, and they may have privileged access to certain customers. You would have that kind of situation. But from the SOE standpoint, they look at the private companies. They would say, well, you don't have any sort of social responsibility like we, right? If you're SOE, you have to play a major burden. You have to take on a major burden because you have to take care of the society as part of your agenda. Whereas private companies don't. They just look out for the shareholders' value, right? So it's always a trade-off. It's not always good or bad. At the end of the day, it's a balance.
So in terms of the structure of the Chinese economy, we also saw over the past couple of years this mixed ownership structure. And of course, it's always been embedded in the Chinese economic model, but now more prominently, we saw that Tencent invested in, I believe, China Unicom.
Right.
And then Geely, the automobile company, invested in China Railway. And so you started to see private companies investing in state-owned enterprises. And I believe last year, according to some public records, because of over leverage, a lot of these publicly traded Chinese companies that were sole founder as the largest shareholder, because of leverage, they ended up having to sell the majority stake, and actually the government, you could say the government bailed them out. And so then you started to see government, state sector investing in private sector, and those are the companies, because they're public, that we could see and track. So you're starting to see one investing into the other, and so we're starting to create this mixed ownership structure. I would call it a hybrid, right? It's neither this nor that.
Yes. Well, as you know. Sorry, go ahead.
In the future, I had this debate with a senior official from Europe the other day at the LSE. And so I asked him, I said, how do you define state-owned companies in China? He was trying to track the number of state-owned companies in China. I said, well, today, how do you define a state-owned? 80% state ownership, 5% state ownership? How do you define state ownership even today? State-owned companies.
Well, as you know, Shirley, in Chinese there is a saying, and Martina, you know that too very well. It is 你中有我，我中有你. And that's very much, as you know, is a key philosophy in Chinese. And the Chinese practices, in many ways, the Chinese do things. And within this context of what you're talking about, we're seeing this increasingly more mixed up situation. And you have me, or you are part of me, I am part of you. And that's just the way things will work. And I expect that trend will continue to go on in the future.